tuning in to watch these lectures on church history. I'm just trying to give an overview here because I know a lot of people don't get a chance to study these things and don't know some of these facts about our history. And I really think they affect who we are today as Christians and affect how we came to be in the different uh, divisions of Christianity in which we find ourselves. That's why I've been talking about schisms, for example. Why are we divided into Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and then Protestant division? So I think it's very important to know about our history because you understand some of the issues, and some of those issues are still with us. It makes you think through what you believe and why you're in the group you're in. You know, it's important. And so today I want to follow up on this teaching about the divisions, the schisms. You recall I talked about the first major schism was of the Oriental Orthodox, who were monophysites. They believed that Christ has one nature rather than two natures in one person. And those are called the Oriental Orthodox, and they're in Egypt and Ethiopia and then to the east over in Iran, Iraq, in Syria, and all the way into Asia as well, other parts of Asia. The second great division was between the East and West, the what we call the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic, the Western churches. And we're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation later. But in between here, I need to talk about some other things. I want to talk first about the rise of Islam. And this is something I'm very fascinated with. I've read a lot of books on Islam. I've read the whole Quran, and it's very fascinating and it's very, very pertinent for the day in which we live when terrorism is practically a daily occurrence or weekly occurrence. And we have to face the rise of Islam. We have Muslim Congress people now in our country swearing their oath of office on the Quran. We have whole Muslim communities where there are large groups of Somalis or Iraqis or various other groups, and that's affecting us. Well, let's just talk a little bit about the rise of Islam. Muhammad is supposed to have lived and died he died around 630 or 632, and his followers then took his religion and his approach to life and in a remarkably short time they swept out of Saudi Arabia and took over the whole Levant, which is, you know, the area of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, as we call it. They swept then over all Egypt and all of North Africa, and they then spread to the east as well. And they made it all the way to India. India today is the country with the second largest population of Muslims. By the way, you might be surprised to learn Indonesia is the country with the largest population of Muslims, not Saudi Arabia, because Indonesia has 100 million some people, and they're mostly Muslim. So the Islam spread all over the world. It was actually the fastest and most extensive spread of an empire in history, faster than Alexander the Great, even, or any of the Roman conquests and so forth. It was a remarkable achievement. And I've read some about it and written some papers on it and so forth. And it's quite surprising. Usually the armies weren't that large. You might be surprised to learn. Small groups. They lived off the land. They didn't have large supply lines and so forth. And in a very quick way, they were kind of like guerrilla warriors, just spreading out. And yet they toppled countries and empires everywhere. The Muslims, of course, will tell you that that's because Allah was with them, and it was because they're believers in His true religion, true monotheistic religion, Islam, and so they were unified because of their religion and so forth, and Allah was with them, and that's why this incredibly rapid conquest took place. Actually, that is historically probably not true. I know it's controversial. People will argue it both ways. But I've read quite a bit on the subject, and I can tell you that, for example, in the early days, Islam conquered the Persian Empire, and eventually they conquered the Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople. well, those were great empires for hundreds of years. In fact, Byzantine Empire lasted 1,000 years. So, you would say that's a tremendous achievement to conquer these empires. Well, true. However, it's important to recognize that, for example, the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire had been slugging it out with each other for hundreds of years. They were at war with each other. Even the Romans, when it was one empire, the Romans had fought the Persians. Persians are very ancient people. They had an empire way before anybody, just about anybody else, long before Islam. The Persians were a great empire under Cyrus and so on. And but the Persians and the Byzantines had been fighting for a couple hundred years intensely. They'd bled each other white. They'd wrecked each other's economies. So basically, they were in a very weakened state when Islam rose up and surged out across there. And there's a lot of other things. Muhammad, at first, he led raids. He was a warlord, and he led his group, the Quraysh, in raids against other Arabians, right? And they raided caravans and so forth. They had to make a living. When he was kicked out of Mecca, he had to go up to Medina, and for a while there, they made a living by raiding caravans. And so he turned out to be a pretty good military leader. And he told his people they could have 4 wives, and they could divide the plunder and so forth. So his folks started to like him. He won some battles, and they were richer than they had been. They were just Bedouins. They were just poor and scattered and weak. And he kind of united them, and they won battles. They won a lot of loot. They got to have more women. Hey, what's not to like? And so, but one of his rules was you can't raid other Muslims. So they raided the other Arabs who weren't Muslim yet. And then once they defeated them, conquered them, they converted them, right? You had to become a Muslim. Well, that meant that you couldn't raid them anymore. So Islam, from its very initiation, was a warlike, plundering sort of movement that wasn't just religion. It wasn't just about religion. Just like the Protestant Reformation, as we'll see, wasn't just about theological differences. There were a lot of other factors that made it just sort of take off. Same thing with Islam. There were a lot of factors that took off. And it was a sort of a political and a sort of a militaristic and a raiding sort of religion. And that caused it to prosper and thrive because you got to keep the loot. And it also caused Islam, from its very birth, to be a warlike conquering movement, because you couldn't raid other Muslims. Therefore, you got to go to other places and raid other groups. And so you can see it just was kind of baked in from its very initiation that Islam was this warlike movement. And it swept out of there, out of Saudi Arabia, what we call it today, and just conquered the known world, and was a remarkable achievement. And that caused many, many areas that had been predominantly Christian. Egypt was a Christian country. Syria was a Christian country. Much of Persia was Christian. It caused many, North Africa was all Christian. It caused these areas that had been dominated by Christianity to suddenly come under the domination of a totally different religion. And so Christianity ceased to be the dominant religion in vast areas, and forever afterward, it was a persecuted minority. By the way, I got to just point out a couple things that are just interesting, I think, as sidelines. I digress for a minute, but there's a book by Robert Spencer that about did Muhammad even exist? And this, again, is very controversial and debatable, but it's pretty interesting that we have the first records of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's a creed, a segment of a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that was probably written 5 years after his death and resurrection. We have the Gospels written about 30 years after his death and resurrection. So we have eyewitness accounts that date from very early times, right after, relatively speaking, the death and resurrection of Christ. But the first biographical documents about Muhammad don't appear until about 150 to 300 years after his supposed death. And that's pretty interesting if you think about it, that Nobody wrote anything about the life of this supposed great prophet who's the final prophet sent by God to the world. Nobody wrote anything about him biographically for 150 to 300 years. Can you imagine if the only documents we had today about George Washington were written 150 years after his death? How reliable would such documents be? So it's just interesting. And there are those like Robert Spencer who say Muhammad never even existed. He was kind of an invention that the Arabs eventually came up with to kind of justify what they were doing in their conquests and so forth, and kind of unify people and drive them to do more. And there are those on the other side who argue the other side and so on. But I would urge you to look it up. It's very interesting. Um, you have uh, so many traditions of Islam are not based on the actual Quran, but they're based on the other documents, the supposed biographical documents that were written about Muhammad. Well, they were written years after. So how do you know that how many wives he had and what his eating habits were and how he treated his slaves and so forth, if the only stuff that was written so long after the fact? It's not very reliable. But be that as I may, I digress. I also take another digression here. I just want to say that many today speak about how Islam is more tolerant than Christianity because it's a known fact that the Jews, for example, welcomed the takeover of Muslims in some cases, not in the early days because Muhammad slaughtered Jews in Arabia. But at later times, Jews actually welcomed Muslim takeover because Christians persecuted them, and that's a fact. Early Christians, we have to recognize that. They struggled so much with the Jews rejected their Messiah. The Jews were the first persecutors of Christians, of course. And then the Romans came in and persecuted Christians. But later, the tide changed, and it was Christians who persecuted Jews because the Jews were stubborn. They wouldn't accept Christ as Messiah. They sometimes influenced Christians to turn back to Judaism and turn away from Christianity. So some Christian leaders were vehemently opposed to Jews and ordered them kicked out. Like, in 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus came and discovered America, the Jews were all kicked out of Spain. And there were times, and even the book of Acts speaks about the Emperor Claudius kicking the Jews out of Rome and so forth. So the Muslims tended to welcome and keep the Jews, allow the Jews to practice their religion as people of the book. And so Jews tended to like Muslim takeover. And in some areas, particularly Andalusia, which is Spain, there was a very unique kind of experience there between Christians, Muslims, and Jews that they all kind of worked together for quite a while there. There was quite a cooperation that went on. Various scholars interacted with one another. It was Muslims who brought the teachings of Aristotle and so forth to the West. And so it was kind of a golden age of the interaction between Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And many people point to that as how tolerant the Muslims were. But you need to know that in history, it's not really the common experience. Rather, what we mostly have in history is very bloody interaction between Muslims and Christians. They slaughtered the Christians, they persecuted the Christians, and so on. But they did interact peaceably in, as I say, Spain and some other areas. And the interactions were actually quite complex because there were times when Christians, for example, Muslims would conquer a region, but then they didn't have much administrative experience. And there were Christians who were in prominent positions, and the Muslims allowed them to continue doing what they were doing. They used their expertise. So you would have Christians in very prominent positions in Muslim courts and so on. And a lot of times you'll hear of developments that the Muslims came up with, like algebra or navigation, certain navigational skills, or certain astronomical discoveries and so on, even Arabic numerals and so forth. They're called Arab numerals, right? Our number system. And that's credited to the Muslims, but actually, if you look into it, it was the people of India who came up with that, and the Muslims borrowed it from them because they traded with them. And many of the great so-called scientific discoveries of Islam were actually discovered by Christians or Jews who lived in the Muslim world. Be that as it may, Islam arose and it annihilated Christianity in a lot of the world, and it created a totally different sort of environment that has continued to this day. Now, the Muslims themselves were actually invaded by the Mongols, and the Mongols slaughtered a lot of Muslims for a while. But then a lot of Mongols converted to Islam. And by the way, a lot of Mongols also converted to Christianity. They took Nestorian women as their wives and ended up becoming Christians and became more favorable to Christianity. But the Mongol invasions and the Muslim invasions would drastically affect the Christianity of Asia and the Middle East. By the way, it seems that for the most part, the Mongols were actually tolerant. I was surprised to learn that. Several Khans, Genghis Khan, the leaders were called Khans. Several Khans actually married Nestorian women, and Christian influence was allowed to continue and expand. And in my study for this, I learned about a guy named Alepen. And I had never heard of him, even though I've been studying missions and things like that for my whole life. Many years I've studied missionaries and missions and read many books, but I never heard of Alepen. And Alepen, it turns out, was a Nestorian missionary to China in about 635 AD. And there's actually a stele that was dug up, a stone that mentions him. And he was a man who was welcomed by the rulers of China. And one of the rulers at that time of one of the dynasties was quite scholarly. And he heard about this Alepen man coming and that he was very learned and so forth. He invited him to come to him and teach him his religion. So Alepen taught the actual emperor of China Christianity. And so the emperor said, this is good. This is really good. We need to have this propagated or promulgated. And so he ordered that Alepen go and meet with scholars at the royal library, and they translated what he said into Chinese and had it spread around. Eventually, the Chinese turned on that. The next leaders were against it, and they eradicated it. And it wasn't found till modern times. This discovery was made about this guy named Alepen. However, most of the Mongols converted to Islam. And when the Han Chinese took over, they overthrew the Mongols, and they also expelled all the Christian missionaries. So Islam rose up. Islam eradicated Christianity. A large part of Islam clashed with Christianity, interacted with Christianity. Many of the greatest scholars of Christianity have had to deal with Islam, and we still are doing it today, arguing the case for the deity of Christ, and the case for the Trinity, and the case for salvation being necessary. All people need to be saved through the Lord Jesus Christ. You can't be saved by just works like Islam teaches, by just following the Quran and so on. But it's played a big role. Now, I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about the Crusades. It's important to know about the Crusades. Again, this is an issue that many misunderstand. Many today lament the Crusades. Many Christians talk about what a horrible legacy it left the Christian church. We've harmed our witness to the Muslim world. And, still today they don't accept Christ because of the Crusades and so on. And we shouldn't have done this. It wasn't a biblical thing and all that. And of course, I got to agree with that. Jesus never launched wars like, Muhammad, he launched jihad. He fought. He was a warrior. Jesus didn't launch wars. He told Peter to put up his sword and so on, right? When he cut off the high priest servant's ear. And Jesus never did that. And so what right did the popes have to launch crusades? Okay, very good. A good case can be made for pacifism in Christianity. That's a very biblical position to take. You don't have to be a pacifist to be a Christian, but it's very biblical to be one and very, very understandable to be one. Having said all that, I'd like to just explain a few things about the Crusades that many may not realize. Number one, the Crusades were originally a defensive effort. They were defensive. It's like the people could say the war of Northern aggression against the South, the Civil War. But it was Fort Sumter that fired the first shot. The South actually fired the first shot, and the Civil War was a response to the aggression of the South. Well, it's the same kind of thing here. People say the Christians, they launched these wars against the Muslims. Well, guess what? Christians wanted to go to the Holy Lands. They wanted to see the places where Jesus walked and so on. And when they went over there, they had done that for hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, when the Muslims took power, they began to persecute them and they wouldn't let them come there, or they mistreated them, or they charged them too much money and so forth. And it was dangerous to go to the Holy Lands, the lands where our Savior walked and where our church began. Christians wanted to see those places, and they had always had the freedom to go there, and Islam sort of closed that off. At the same time, the Muslims were constantly moving toward Constantinople, moving toward Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, wanting to take it over. And so there was a sense in which there was a need to defend our Christian brothers in the East. That was another reason for launching the Crusades. We need to defend the Christian brothers in the East. The church needs to be unified. We need to reunite Western and Eastern branches of Christianity. All these kinds of things played into it. And then it was Pope Urban II, not Keith Urban, but Urban II. He launched the first crusade with a sermon in 1096 in response to an appeal for help from the Byzantine emperor. See, the Byzantines were asking, help us. These Muslims are knocking at our door. By the way, I got to take another digression here. Did you know that when the Muslims finally conquered Jerusalem in this, I believe it was the 700s AD, did you know that the patriarch of Jerusalem, a guy named, I think it was Sophonius or Sophonicus, I can't remember, I'll look it up, but he actually went out to represent the Christian city to the Muslim conquerors, and he wrote up a report about being conquered by these people. It's very interesting. This is in Robert Spencer's book, Did Muhammad Exist? He wrote that Arabs had conquered the city. This man, who was a patriarch, a Christian minister, a leader, a preacher, it's very interesting that he never wrote that these Arabs had a new religion called Islam, or a new holy book, or that they had a new prophet. He didn't mention any of those things. Very strange. One of the reasons why we wonder if Muhammad even really existed, or if the early Islamic invasion was really Islamic. Because this religious leader, you'd have thought of anybody, he would have written in his history, man, we were conquered by these people from another religion. It's a heresy, a false religion. They got a false prophet and everything, the Antichrist, and they conquered us. Not a word. I digress. I just wanted to mention that to you because it's an interesting factor. But returning to the idea of the Crusades. So Pope Urban II launched the first crusade with a sermon in 1096 and said to the people, we need to help our brothers in the Byzantine Empire. And, as I said, many people expound about how unchristian this was. But think about this. It was a real threat. This was an enemy army with a false doctrine. They hated Christ. They were against Christ because Islam is anti-Christian. It says Christ is not the Son of God. It says there isn't a Trinity. It says Christ didn't die on the cross for our sins. You don't need that. That's anti-Christian, folks. So it was a threat, a military threat, a religious threat, a heretical threat against the church. And the Pope said, we need to do something about this. We need to launch a war. Now, you can say it's not Christian, but it's kind of like, is it not Christian to defend yourself? If somebody's breaking into your house and you have a pistol, can you use it? I would say yes. Some Christians are pacifists and they would say no. The thing is, it was a defensive action originally. That's what the Crusades really were. And scholars differ on the exact number of Crusades. It seems that there were 9 major ones, but there were also some minor ones. So there's different counts that people come up with. The 4th Crusade actually ended up horribly being a crusade against the very Christian Byzantine Empire. They actually laid siege to Byzantium, to Constantinople. And that resulted in great bitterness and resentment and damage to the cause of Christ that continues to this day. The East never forgot what the West did to them. They attacked their own city, but it's kind of complicated. I can't go into it now, but actually, originally the emperor there asked for for the Crusaders to help him, and it just turned bad. It went south. He came to help this one emperor, but then when the Latins took over the city, they ended up raping and killing and just pillaging and so forth, and they ended up making it their own kingdom. And they put in a guy named Baldwin the First, and he ruled from 1204 to 1261. So the Latin Empire actually took over the Eastern Greek Empire for a number of years, and a number of areas were conquered. And then over the next decades, those places were eventually reconquered. So there's a lot of warfare between Christians there. There was all kind of bitterness, all kind of resentment. And but as I say, originally the reason the Byzantines, the reason the Western Crusaders came in is because the Byzantines asked them to, because they were having a civil war and they asked for the Crusaders to help. By the way, there was another crusade that was against a heretical sect. It wasn't against Muslims at all. It was against the people called the Cathars or the Albigensians in France, in Gaul at that time. It was called Gaul, but that's modern France. These Albigensians, or these Cathari, as they were called, it was a cult. They kind of really became prominent and took over a large area of Gaul. And so the Pope actually asked for help against them, and that crusade lasted 20 years. And the Pope, ordered people to go and fight there. And so they went there thinking they'd get, indulgences and all, make it to heaven and all if they fought in this war. And they went to help the King of France. And what that ended up doing was actually strengthening the King of France, the monarchy of France and so forth. And it enabled the King of France to gain more territory. And what it ended up doing, it kind of backfired on the Pope, because it made the popes more dependent ever after on French kings. And eventually that led to even having the headquarters of the Pope in Avignon, France, for a period of years. It moved from Rome to Avignon. And so that's where the Vatican was located. It was in France. And this Albigensian crusade also played a role in the institutionalization of the Dominican order, because they were raised up to kind of go in there and preach against the heresies of these Cathari or these Albigensians, to preach the doctrines of the Catholic Church. And so the Dominican order rose up through that, but also the Inquisition kind of became strong, because that was another way the church could fight against heresy. So they started the Inquisition, and they would torture these heretics and so forth to eradicate heresy. But anyway, so there were all kind of crusades. And just so you'll know, 4 different crusader kingdoms ended up being established in the Levant, in the area of Palestine, as a result of the Crusades. These were called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the country of Tripoli, and the country or the county of Edessa. So Tripoli, Edessa, with an E, Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But these kingdoms, they were short-lived. They only lasted from about 1098 to 1291. And then they ended up falling back eventually under the domination of Muslims again. And of course, the greatest Muslim leader who really wiped out the Crusaders was Salahuddin, or we call him Saladin. And he actually came from Kurdistan. I was there in the area where he lived in northern Iraq, where he came from. But he was a great military leader, and so he conquered. And you can see the movie Kingdom of Heaven by produced by Ridley Scott, or directed by Ridley Scott. I don't remember which, but it kind of tells about this in a loose sort of way. But Saladin apparently was a sort of a nobleman, but you got to realize it's very curious. But often the Christians would side with Muslims against other Christians, or Muslims would side with Christians against other Muslims. This kind of stuff went on for hundreds of years. By the way, we'll talk about it later when I talk about the Reformation. But did you know that the Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, during the time when the Reformation was getting started, he actually interacted with the Persian Empire? He wanted them to help him. With Muslims, he wanted Muslims to help him fight against the Turks. So here's a Christian emperor interacting, asking for help from Muslim Persians to fight against Muslim Turks. And then the King of France actually sided with the Turks against, he wanted to help the Turks fight his opponent, Charles V, the Christian emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So this kind of stuff has gone on for hundreds of years too. So when we talk about the Crusades, how dark they were, what a dark period of Christian history they were, yeah, in a way, but you got to understand the times, you got to understand all the complexities of it and how it was a very much of a defensive effort in many ways. And by the way, one other thing I just want to point out, you got to also take into consideration the fact that popes during those years of the Crusades were very much involved in politics. So they were practically political leaders. Remember, I read a quote in an earlier lecture about how the popes in the West were practically emperors and emperors in the East were practically popes. Well, when you have the Pope being practically, for all practical purposes, the political leader of the people, you can understand why he would take an action like ordering a war, because he's a political leader. He's responsible for the defense of his empire, so to speak. And so I'm not totally defending it, but I am giving you some of the rationalizations and excuses and reasons behind the Crusades. We'll end this discussion there, and then next time we're going to start talking about the lineup or the way in which the church came to the time of the Reformation. I hope you'll tune in then.